July 7, 1944, just outside Saint-Lô, Normandy. The morning fog hung thick over the Bocage countryside as Staff Sergeant Wilson Jefferson of the 761st Tank Battalion squinted through his periscope, the rumble of his Sherman tank's engine drowning out the distant artillery fire. He believed they were ready for what lay ahead, a simple flanking maneuver against disorganized German resistance. In less than 48 hours, everything he thought he knew about war, about himself and about his place in history, would be fundamentally transformed. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how Black American soldiers not only fought against the Nazi war machine, but destroyed deeply held myths about race and combat effectiveness that would ultimately help transform American society itself. Winter, 1942. Fort Knox, Kentucky. The crisp morning air stung First Lieutenant James Porter's face as he marched across the parade grounds, his breath visible in small clouds that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. At 34, Porter was older than most of his fellow officers and considerably older than the enlisted men he would be training. With 15 years of military experience behind him, he had been handpicked to help prepare one of the Army's newest tank battalions. "Attention," barked the sergeant as Porter entered the barracks. 50 black soldiers snapped to attention, their faces expressionless as military protocol demanded, though Porter could sense the tension in the air. He had seen that look before, the cautious assessment of a new white officer by black troops who had already experienced more than their share of discrimination, even while wearing the uniform of their country. "At ease, men," Porter said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'm Lieutenant James Porter. I've been assigned as your training officer for armored combat operations. Some of you may have heard rumors that Negro tank battalions will never see combat. I'm here to tell you those rumors are false." Porter paused, making eye contact with several of the men before continuing. "The 761st Tank Battalion will be combat ready in 6 months. Whether you go overseas or not isn't my decision, but I guarantee when I'm done with you, there won't be a single valid reason to keep you stateside. Any questions?" Private First Class Johnny Wilson, a 20-year-old from Detroit with broad shoulders and serious eyes, raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, we've heard this before. They've been training colored units for years and then using us for service duties or keeping us on base. What makes this different?" Porter nodded. The question was fair. "What makes this different, Private, is the war itself. The Germans have pushed deep into Soviet territory. The Japanese control most of the Pacific. We're going to need every man, every unit, every battalion. Times are changing." What Porter didn't say, couldn't say, was that resistance to deploying black combat units remained strong within the upper echelons of the Army. General Leslie McNair, commanding general of Army Ground Forces, supported the use of black troops in combat roles, but many others did not. The prevailing view among many senior officers was that black soldiers lacked the aggression, intelligence, and leadership qualities necessary for effective combat performance. These views were reinforced by the Army's own War College study from 1925, which had concluded, "The Negro is a citizen of the United States entitled to all of the rights of citizenship and to the protection of the laws. As an individual, he should be accorded the full rights of citizenship. As a race, he should be recognized as a potential military asset and developed accordingly. In physical courage, he is at least the equal of the white man. In physical strength and endurance, he is somewhat superior. Yet in general, he has certain characteristics which place him at a disadvantage as a soldier." Such scientific racism formed the foundation of military policy regarding black troops, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Denied proper training, equipment, and leadership, black units often struggled, which was then taken as evidence of their inherent unsuitability for combat. But Porter knew different. He had seen the determination in the eyes of these men. Many had volunteered specifically to fight, rejecting the safe alternative of defense industry jobs that paid better and didn't involve the daily humiliations of a segregated military. "Sir," called out another voice, belonging to Corporal Horace Evans, a former mathematics teacher from Philadelphia. "Will we be integrated with white tank battalions or fighting separately?" "You'll be operating as an independent battalion, attached to whatever division needs you most," Porter replied. That's standard procedure for tank battalions, regardless of the color of the men inside the tanks. What he didn't add was that this arrangement would at least partially shield the men from the worst aspects of army segregation once in combat zones. Tank battalions, by their nature, operated with significant autonomy. As the weeks turned into months, the men of the 761st trained relentlessly. They learned the intricacies of the M4 Sherman tank, its strengths, reliability, decent armor, good speed, and its critical weaknesses, the tendency of its gasoline engine to catch fire when hit, earning it the grim nickname Ronson after the popular cigarette lighter advertised to light first time every time. The battalion was composed of 6 companies, Headquarters Company and Service Company, plus Companies A through D, each equipped with 17 Sherman tanks. Each tank had a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. Working together effectively required hundreds of hours of practice, with each man learning not only his primary role, but also how to step into any other position if casualties occurred. Staff Sergeant Wilson Jefferson emerged as one of the battalion's most promising tank commanders. At 25, Jefferson had already overcome numerous obstacles in his life before the war. Born in Macon, Georgia, he had moved north to Chicago with his family as part of the Great Migration when he was 12. Despite graduating near the top of his class in high school, he found most opportunities closed to him because of his race. He had been working as a mechanic when the war broke out, his technical knowledge making him a natural fit for the armored forces. Jefferson, Lieutenant Porter called out one day after a particularly grueling training exercise. "A word." Jefferson approached, removing his tanker's helmet and wiping sweat from his brow. "Yes, sir?" "That was good work today, getting your tank through that obstacle course while maintaining accurate fire. Your time was the best in the company." "Thank you, sir." Porter lowered his voice. "You know, in combat, the Germans are going to be targeting officers first. Tank commanders are high-priority targets. I need men I can count on to take charge if officers go down." Jefferson stood a little straighter. "You can count on me, sir." "I know I can. That's why I'm recommending you for officer candidate school." Jefferson's expression didn't change, but his eyes widened slightly. "Sir, with all due respect, how many Negro officers have you seen in tank battalions?" Porter sighed. "Not enough. But things are changing, Jefferson. This war is too big, too important for the old ways." In reality, change was coming, but slowly. In 1941, there were fewer than 10 black officers in the entire U.S. Army. By 1943, there would be thousands, though most were assigned to service units rather than combat formations. The 761st would eventually have several black officers, though the higher command positions remained reserved for whites. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the war was reaching a crucial turning point. In the summer of 1943, American and British forces had successfully invaded Sicily, knocking Italy out of the war. On the Eastern Front, the massive Battle of Kursk had ended in a decisive Soviet victory. For the first time since the war began, it was clear that Nazi Germany would eventually be defeated. The only questions were how long it would take and how many lives would be lost in the process. By April 1943, the 761st Tank Battalion had completed its basic training and moved to Camp Hood, Texas, for advanced armored warfare training. There they encountered the harsh realities of the Jim Crow South. Despite wearing the uniform of the United States Army, the men were barred from white establishments in nearby Killeen. The officers' club on base was officially off-limits to the few black officers in the battalion. This contradiction, being asked to fight and potentially die for freedoms they themselves were denied, was not lost on the men. As Private First Class William McBurney put it in a letter to his mother in Harlem, "They expect us to battle the world's greatest evil in Hitler, while treating us like we're not even full citizens. But I'll tell you this, Mama, we're going to prove ourselves so thoroughly, they won't be able to deny us anything when this is all over." The frustration boiled over one night when several soldiers from the 761st were refused service at a local diner despite being in uniform. Military police were called, and in the ensuing confrontation, shots were fired. Miraculously, no one was killed, but the incident highlighted the explosive tensions that existed. Lieutenant Porter was called to the office of Colonel Frank Milburn, the white commander of the 761st. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes people question whether Negro troops should be in combat roles, Milburn said, not bothering to hide his frustration. Fighting in town instead of saving it for the Germans. With respect, sir, Porter replied carefully. The men were in uniform and simply trying to get a meal. They weren't looking for trouble. That doesn't matter, Porter. You know as well as I do that the 761st is under a microscope. There are plenty of people up the chain who would love nothing more than to see this experiment fail, and have you all reassigned to driving trucks or building airfields. Porter knew Milburn was right, even if the situation was deeply unfair. The burden of proving themselves fell entirely on the black troops, who were expected to endure indignities with stoic forbearance. I'll speak to the men, certainly, Porter said, but it would help if they had some assurance that their training means something, that they'll actually get to prove themselves against the enemy. Milburn's expression softened slightly. As a matter of fact, I received word this morning. Orders are coming through. The 761st is shipping out to England next month. We're going to be part of the European Theatre of Operations. The news spread through the battalion like wildfire. After more than a year of intensive training, they would finally get their chance. The reaction was a mixture of excitement, pride, and apprehension, the same emotions felt by any soldiers heading into combat, regardless of race. For Staff Sergeant Jefferson, now returned from officer candidate school as a newly commissioned second lieutenant, the deployment brought a complex mix of feelings. The previous year had been a roller coaster, the pride of earning his commission tempered by the reality that even as an officer he faced restrictions and prejudices. His white counterparts did not. "We're really going," said Corporal Horace Evans, finding Jefferson alone one evening as he checked over equipment manifests for the transatlantic journey. "We are," Jefferson confirmed. "Having second thoughts?" Evans shook his head. "Not about fighting, but I keep thinking about what we're fighting for. Democracy, freedom. And then I think about my cousin who got lynched in Mississippi last year for registering black voters." Jefferson was silent for a moment. "I think about that too. But that's exactly why we have to do this, and do it better than anyone else. We're not just fighting for America as it is, but for what it could be, should be." Evans nodded slowly. "You think it'll make a difference how we perform over there?" "It has to," Jefferson said, with more confidence than he felt. "The way I see it, every Nazi we kill is a blow against fascism abroad and racism at home. They're cut from the same cloth." In September 1943, the 761st boarded a converted ocean liner in New York Harbor, part of a massive convoy heading to England. The Atlantic crossing was tense with the ever-present threat of German U-boat attacks. The men were confined below decks most of the time. The crowded conditions made worse by the segregated arrangements that gave black troops less space than their white counterparts. They arrived in Liverpool to find an England that, while not free from racial prejudice, offered a noticeably different reception than what they'd experienced in the American South. In English pubs, black soldiers were generally served without issue, leading to some memorable encounters with white American soldiers who objected to their presence. For the next several months, the 761st continued training, now under conditions designed to simulate actual combat in Europe. They participated in large-scale exercises with other American units preparing for what everyone knew would be the eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied France. D-Day came on June 6, 1944, but the 761st was not part of the initial landings. Instead, they continued training and preparation, incorporating lessons learned from the first weeks of the Normandy campaign. Reports from the front emphasized the difficulty of tank warfare in the Norman Bocage, a landscape of small fields surrounded by ancient earthen berms topped with dense hedgerows that formed natural anti-tank barriers. Finally, in late July 1944, the order came. The 761st would deploy to France, attached to the 26th Infantry Division, part of General George Patton's Third Army. Before they shipped out, Patton himself addressed the battalion. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled troops without need of amplification. "I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut bastards." Patton's speech, though characteristically profane and direct, was also remarkably free of the condescension that often characterized white officers' addresses to black troops. He spoke to them as soldiers, first and foremost, with a simple mission: defeat the enemy. "Everyone has their eyes on you," Patton continued. "Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." The battalion roared its approval. Whatever his personal views on race might have been, Patton had given them what they craved most: the chance to prove themselves in combat under a commander who valued fighting ability above all else. Days later, the men of the 761st found themselves on the shores of Normandy, moving inland toward the front lines. The hedgerow country had been largely cleared by this point, but the evidence of fierce fighting was everywhere. Burnt-out tanks, both American and German, crumbled stone farmhouses, hastily dug graves marked with helmets on rifles. Lieutenant Jefferson stood in the turret of his Sherman, designated Black Cat in reference to the battalion's nickname Black Panthers, surveying the battle-scarred landscape. The peaceful Norman countryside had been transformed by war, much as Jefferson himself had been transformed by his experiences of the past 2 years. The idealistic mechanic from Chicago was now a battle-ready tank officer, prepared to lead his men into combat against the vaunted German panzer forces. The next morning, July 7, 1944, the 761st moved into position for their first combat operation, supporting an infantry assault against German positions near the crucial road junction town of St. Lo. The plan called for Jefferson's Company B to provide the left flank protection, while Companies A and C made the main thrust alongside infantry units from the 26th Division. "All tanks, this is Panther 6, came the voice of Major Richard Lewis, the battalion operations officer. Over the radio. "Movement order in effect. Proceed to start line and await further orders." Jefferson acknowledged the command and signaled his driver to advance. The 5 Sherman tanks under his direct command moved forward in a wedge formation, alert for any sign of German anti-tank positions. They had advanced less than half a mile when the distinctive crack of a high-velocity gun split the air. The Sherman at the far right of Jefferson's formation jerked to a halt, smoke pouring from a hole punched clean through its frontal armor. "Enemy tank, 2 o'clock, behind the stone farmhouse," Jefferson shouted into his radio. "All tanks, evasive action. Gunner, high explosive. Target the farmhouse." Through his periscope, Jefferson caught a glimpse of the German tank, a Panther, far superior to the Sherman in armor and firepower. The Panther's 75mm gun had a muzzle velocity of over 3,000 feet per second, capable of penetrating a Sherman's armor at ranges over a mile. By comparison, the Sherman's 75mm gun struggled to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any range. Jefferson's gunner, Corporal Marcus Williams, fired a high-explosive shell that struck the corner of the farmhouse, sending stone fragments flying, but doing nothing to the German tank sheltering behind it. "Driver, move left, behind that hedgerow," Jefferson ordered, making a split-second decision. "Radio to all tanks, converge from multiple angles. We need to hit their side armor." The next few minutes were chaos as the 4 remaining Shermans in Jefferson's section maneuvered to outflank the Panther. 2 more American tanks were hit and disabled in the process, their crews bailing out into the dubious shelter of the Norman hedgerows. But the tactic worked. A shell from Sergeant Wilkins' tank struck the Panther's track, immobilizing it. Moments later, Jefferson's tank rounded the hedgerow and fired a shell that penetrated the Panther's thinner side armor, setting off a catastrophic internal explosion. The entire engagement had lasted less than 10 minutes, but it had cost the 761st 3 tanks and 7 men, including 2 killed. In return, they had destroyed 1 Panther and forced the German infantry supporting it to retreat. As the dust settled, Jefferson ordered his remaining tanks to secure the position and sent a situation report back to battalion headquarters. Then he climbed down from his tank to check on the wounded and direct the recovery of equipment from the damaged Shermans. Corporal Evans, his face blackened with smoke but otherwise uninjured, approached Jefferson. "Not exactly how I imagined our first fight, sir," he said, his voice tight. "How did you imagine it?" Jefferson asked. surveying the burning wreckage of the Panther and the damaged American tanks. "I don't know. Cleaner, somehow. More. Decisive." Jefferson nodded. "That's not how war works, especially not tank warfare. It's messy, confusing, and often comes down to who sees whom first." He paused. "You did well, Evans, everyone did. We're still here and we completed the objective, that's what matters." As the 761st consolidated their position, they received a new set of orders. The larger offensive towards St. Lo was proceeding ahead of schedule, and they were to push forward to support the infantry's advance. For the next several days, the battalion was in near constant contact with the enemy. They quickly learned the bitter lessons of armored warfare against a determined and experienced opponent. The German forces they faced, elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, were veterans of the Eastern Front, where they had been engaged in brutal combat against Soviet forces for years. The men of the 761st found themselves tested in ways their training could never have prepared them for. The physical exhaustion of operating tanks for days on end, with minimal sleep and constant tension. The psychological strain of knowing that any moment could bring a German anti-tank shell through their armor. The horror of seeing friends burning alive in tanks, hit by enemy fire. Yet they persevered. Their performance earned grudging respect from the white infantry units they supported, many of whom had initially been skeptical about fighting alongside black tankers. "I don't care if they're purple with pink polka dots," remarked one infantry sergeant after the 761st had helped his company secure a heavily defended crossroads. "Those boys can fight, and they don't leave you hanging when things get hot." By mid-August, the 761st had been in continuous combat operations for over a month. They had suffered significant casualties, nearly 20% of their original strength, but had also gained valuable experience. More importantly, they had proven that black tankers could fight just as effectively as whites. Jefferson, now promoted to first lieutenant after his company commander was wounded and evacuated, found himself responsible for the lives of over 50 men. The burden of command weighed heavily on him, especially in the wake of a failed night attack that had cost the lives of 7 men from his company. "You can't blame yourself," Captain Porter told him during a rare quiet moment as they studied maps for the next day's operation. "Night attacks are always risky, and the intelligence was faulty. You got the majority of your men out alive." "That's not good enough," Jefferson replied, his voice hollow with fatigue. "Davis, Martinez, Johnson, Williams, they trusted me to make the right calls." "And you did, with the information you had," Porter insisted. "That's all any commander can do. The moment you start second-guessing yourself is the moment you become ineffective." Jefferson looked up from the map. "Is that how you deal with it, the losses?" Porter was silent for a long moment. "I tell myself that every man here volunteered. They knew the risks. And I tell myself that what we're doing matters, not just for the war but for what comes after." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a courier with new orders. The Allied breakout from Normandy was gaining momentum, and the 761st would be moving east as part of Patton's rapidly advancing Third Army. The next weeks saw a dramatic change in the nature of the fighting. The static, hedgerow-to-hedgerow combat of Normandy gave way to mobile warfare across the open French countryside. Here, the 761st's extensive training in armored tactics came to the fore. They executed classic cavalry-style operations, reconnaissance, screening the flanks of advancing infantry, exploiting breakthroughs and pursuing retreating enemy forces. By September 1944, they had helped liberate dozens of French towns and villages, often being the first American troops the local population had seen. The reception they received was sometimes a study in contradictions. In one small town near Reims, the mayor organized an impromptu celebration for the liberating Americans, only to appear visibly confused when black soldiers emerged from the tanks. "Are you Americans?" he asked in halting English, addressing Lieutenant Jefferson. "Yes, sir," Jefferson replied with a slight smile. "The United States Army, 761st Tank Battalion." "But you are noir," the mayor said, struggling to reconcile the reality before him with his expectations. "Yes, we are black Americans," Jefferson confirmed, and we're here to help liberate your country from the Nazis." The mayor recovered quickly, shaking Jefferson's hand warmly. "Then we are doubly grateful. Welcome to Saint-Martin." Not all encounters were so positive. In another town, an elderly Frenchman refused to believe that black soldiers could be Americans, insisting they must be colonial troops from Africa. In his mind, Americans were white, a perception created by decades of films, books, and cultural exports that had erased the multiracial reality of the United States. Such incidents were educational for both the French civilians and the American soldiers. For many Europeans, this was their first encounter with black Americans, challenging their preconceptions about race and nationality. For the men of the 761st, it provided a perspective on how America was viewed from the outside, and how limited that view often was. As the Allied advance continued, the German resistance stiffened. Having retreated from France, the Wehrmacht was now defending the approaches to their homeland with increasing determination. The 761st found themselves engaged in some of the toughest fighting they had yet experienced as they approached the German border. In late October, near the town of Metz in northeastern France, Jefferson's company was assigned to support an infantry assault on a heavily fortified German position. The terrain was unfavorable for tanks, wooded and hilly, with numerous anti-tank ditches and minefields, channeling movement into pre-registered killing zones covered by German 88mm guns. The attack began at dawn, with artillery preparation followed by the advance of infantry, supported by Jefferson's tanks. Initially, progress was good, with the combined arms force pushing back the German outposts. But as they approached the main defensive line, the situation deteriorated rapidly. "Enemy armor, 11 o'clock," called out Jefferson's gunner as the distinctive silhouette of a German Tiger tank emerged from a tree line 800 yards ahead. The Tiger was the most feared German tank of the war. With its 80mm gun and thick armor, it outclassed the Sherman in every respect. At this range, the Tiger could easily penetrate any part of a Sherman's armor, while the Sherman's 75mm gun would struggle to damage the Tiger even with a direct hit to its vulnerable sides. "All tanks, spread out," Jefferson ordered over the radio. "Use smoke, find cover. We need to flank that monster." Before his orders could be fully executed, the Tiger fired. Its first shell struck the Sherman commanded by Sergeant Willis Johnson, Jefferson's most experienced non-commissioned officer. The round penetrated the frontal armor as if it were paper, detonating the ammunition stored inside. The resulting explosion sent the Sherman's turret flying 30 feet into the air, killing all 5 crewmen instantly. Jefferson fought to control his shock and horror. "Gunner, fire smoke rounds. Driver, reverse behind that ridge." His Sherman backed into defilade position just as 2 more Tigers and several Panzer IVs joined the first, accompanied by German infantry. The American infantry, caught in the open and suddenly facing overwhelming firepower, began to fall back in disarray. "Panther Actual, this is Black Cat." Jefferson radioed to battalion headquarters. "We're facing at least 3 Tigers and multiple Panzer IVs near coordinates Whiskey Tango 53. Infantry pulling back. Request immediate artillery support and reinforcements." "Black Cat, this is Panther Actual," came the response from Major Lewis. "Artillery is unavailable, committed to other sectors. No reinforcements available. Fall back to secondary line and regroup with remaining infantry." Jefferson grimaced. His company was down to 7 operational tanks, facing a vastly superior German force. The textbook response would be to withdraw, preserving his command for future operations. But that would mean abandoning the infantry still caught in the open, many of them wounded. And it would mean another failure attributed to black troops, reinforcing the prejudices they had fought so hard to disprove. Jefferson made his decision. "All tanks, this is Black Cat. We're going to execute Plan Delta, multiple axis attack with maximum dispersion. Target priority is German infantry first, then Panzer IVs. Avoid direct engagement with Tigers. Our mission is to provide covering fire for infantry withdrawal." Plan Delta was a high-risk maneuver they had practiced, but never implemented in combat. It called for tanks to operate independently, using terrain to maximum advantage, appearing and disappearing at different points to create the impression of a larger force and confuse enemy responses. "Sir," came the voice of Lieutenant Morris over the radio, "with respect, Plan Delta requires at least 12 tanks. We've got 7. "Then we'll have to move faster and shoot straighter," Jefferson replied. "Execute the plan, Lieutenant. Our people are dying out there." For the next 30 minutes, the 7 Shermans of Jefferson's company conducted what later military historians would describe as a masterclass in asymmetric armored warfare. They used every fold in the terrain, every cluster of trees, every abandoned building to mask their movements, appearing to fire from one position before quickly relocating to another. They never engaged the Tigers directly, knowing it would be suicidal. Instead, they targeted the German infantry and lighter vehicles, creating corridors through which the American infantrymen could withdraw to safety. The German command, facing what appeared to be a coordinated attack from multiple directions, divided their forces to respond, reducing their overall effectiveness. The Tigers, while powerful, were slow and had limited visibility. By the time they reoriented to a new threat, the Sherman that had fired on their supporting infantry was already gone, attacking from a different position. Jefferson's tank was hit twice during the operation, once by a glancing blow that damaged his radio antenna, and once by a shell that penetrated the rear armor but, miraculously, failed to detonate. His driver, Private First Class Samuel Dixon, was wounded by shrapnel, but refused evacuation, continuing to maneuver the tank despite his injuries. By the time the last American infantryman had retreated to the secondary defensive line, Jefferson's company had lost 2 more tanks, bringing their total to 5 operational vehicles. But they had succeeded in their mission, preventing what could have been a massacre. As Jefferson's tank finally pulled back behind the American lines, he emerged from the turret to find Colonel Williams, the 761st's commanding officer, waiting for him. "That was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever seen, Lieutenant," Williams said, his expression unreadable. Jefferson, exhausted beyond words, simply nodded. "We couldn't leave the infantry, sir." Williams's stern expression softened slightly. "No, you couldn't, and they know it. The CO of the 104th Infantry just radioed me personally to say that if it weren't for the 761st, he'd have lost his entire battalion today." He paused. "There's going to be commendations for this, Jefferson. Distinguished Service Crosses at minimum." Jefferson's laugh held no humor. "Sir, with respect, we both know colored troops don't get DSCs, no matter what they do." Williams frowned. "Times are changing, Lieutenant. This war is changing things." He gestured toward the medical station, where wounded men, black and white, were being treated side by side. "Not fast enough, God knows, but changing nonetheless." In fact, Williams was both right and wrong. The actions of Jefferson's company would indeed be recognized. The 761st as a whole would eventually receive a Presidential Unit Citation, but not until 1978, more than 3 decades after the war. Individual valor awards for black soldiers were routinely downgraded or denied entirely during the war, a practice that would only be rectified decades later through extensive reviews and posthumous awards. The battle near Metz marked a turning point for the 761st. Their reputation spread throughout the Third Army. The Black Panthers, the tankers who wouldn't leave infantry behind, who would take on Tigers to protect their comrades. The racial slurs and skepticism they had faced upon arrival in the European theater didn't disappear, but they diminished significantly. By November 1944, the Allied advance had pushed to the German border. The 761st, now attached to the 103rd Infantry Division, prepared for the assault into Germany itself. The battalion had been in continuous combat for nearly 4 months, suffering significant casualties, but also gaining valuable experience. Replacements had arrived, wide-eyed young men from training facilities in England who looked with awe upon the combat-hardened veterans of Normandy and France. Lieutenant Jefferson, now a company commander following the wounding of his superior, found himself responsible for integrating these new arrivals into his depleted but battle-tested company. "They're so young," Jefferson remarked to Captain Porter during an officers' meeting in a requisitioned German farmhouse just inside the French border. "We were that young once," Porter replied, though it felt like a lifetime ago. 4 months ago, to be exact. Jefferson shook his head. "We were never that young." The 2 men fell silent, contemplating the transformation they had undergone since those training days at Fort Knox. They had entered combat as officers with something to prove, not just to the army, but to themselves and to history. Now they were simply soldiers, concerned primarily with accomplishing their mission and keeping their men alive. The next day, the 761st crossed into Germany as part of a massive offensive. For many of the men, entering the territory of their enemy brought conflicting emotions. They were now in the homeland of Nazism, the source of the racist ideology that had plunged the world into war, and that bore such disturbing similarities to the racism they had experienced their entire lives. Corporal Evans, now a tank commander after battlefield promotions to fill gaps left by casualties, expressed this contradiction during a brief rest period as his crew performed maintenance on their Sherman. "Strange to think about it," he said to Jefferson as they shared a rare cup of hot coffee. "Back home there are restaurants that won't serve me, theaters where I have to sit in the balcony, towns where I can't be after sundown. And here I am, a liberator, bringing freedom to people who wanted to exterminate folks like us." Jefferson nodded. The Germans aren't the only ones with contradictions to answer for when this is all over. As the Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, they began to encounter evidence of Nazi atrocities. The 761st was among the units that liberated several small labor camps, not the death camps that would later become infamous, but places where prisoners of war and civilian captives were worked to death under horrific conditions. For the black American soldiers, these discoveries had a profound impact. They had heard rumors of Nazi persecution, particularly of Jews, but the reality exceeded anything they had imagined. The skeletal prisoners they liberated, many too weak to stand, presented undeniable evidence of humanity's capacity for cruelty. At one such camp near the town of Klein-Blittersdorf, Jefferson encountered a Jewish prisoner who spoke English. The man, who introduced himself as David Rosenberg, had been a professor of literature at the University of Vienna before the war. "Americans," Rosenberg said, his voice barely above a whisper, as Jefferson offered him water and emergency rations. "We knew you would come eventually." His gaze traveled over Jefferson's features, taking in his dark skin. "You are African American?" Jefferson nodded. "Yes, sir." A weak smile crossed Rosenberg's emaciated face. "The Nazis, they hate you too, you know. In their racial theories, black people are considered Untermenschen, subhuman, just like Jews." "I know," Jefferson replied quietly. "We've got some similar ideas back home, though maybe not quite so industrialized." Rosenberg grasped Jefferson's arm with surprising strength. "Then you understand. What is happening here? It is the logical endpoint of all racial hatred, the final destination of dehumanization." The encounter stayed with Jefferson long after Rosenberg was evacuated to a military hospital. He found himself reflecting on it during quiet moments, seeing the connections between the extreme horrors of Nazi Germany and the more familiar injustices of American segregation. Both systems were built on the premise that some humans were worth less than others, deserving fewer rights, less dignity, less life. These reflections were interrupted by the harsh realities of combat as the war entered its final desperate phase. The German forces, now fighting on their home soil, contested every mile with fanatical determination. The winter of 1944-1945 was brutally cold, adding weather to the list of enemies the Allied forces faced. In December, the Germans launched their last major offensive of the war, the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st, positioned south of the main German thrust, was not directly involved in the initial fighting. However, as American forces scrambled to respond to the surprise attack, the battalion was ordered north to help counter German advances. The movement to their new position was hampered by heavy snow, icy roads, and the general chaos of an army reacting to strategic surprise. The 761st traveled over 150 miles in 3 days through bitter cold, many tanks breaking down along the way due to mechanical failures caused by the extreme conditions. When they finally arrived at their assigned position near the town of Bastogne, they found themselves in the middle of what would become one of the most famous battles of the Western Front. Bastogne, a crucial road junction, was surrounded by German forces. The American 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of other units that had been caught in the area when the German offensive began, was holding the town in a desperate defense. The 761st was tasked with helping break the siege, punching through German lines to establish a corridor to the besieged forces. It was an ambitious objective for a single tank battalion, but by this point in the war, such assignments were routine for the Black Panthers. The attack began in the pre-dawn hours of December 22, 1944. The tanks of the 761st, accompanied by infantry from the 26th Division, advanced through heavy snow toward the German positions. Visibility was poor, with fog and snow limiting sight to less than 100 yards in many areas. Jefferson's company led the assault, moving cautiously through a forested area known to contain German anti-tank positions. The dense woods combined with the snow made it almost impossible to spot camouflaged enemy emplacements before they opened fire. The first indication of enemy presence came when a 75-limit anti-tank gun fired from less than 50 yards away, destroying the lead tank in Jefferson's column. The blast killed the driver and assistant driver instantly. The other 3 crew members managed to escape the burning vehicle into the snow. "Contact front," Jefferson called into his radio. "Anti-tank gun at 11 o'clock, in the tree line." His gunner, Sergeant Ray Thomas, traversed the turret and fired a high-explosive shell into the area where Jefferson had spotted the muzzle flash. The shell detonated among the trees, but a second shot from the German gun proved it was still operational. This time, the round struck Jefferson's tank, penetrating the lower frontal hull. The Sherman shuddered from the impact, and acrid smoke began filling the crew compartment. "Fire in the engine," called the driver, Private Dixon. "Control's not responding. Everybody out," Jefferson ordered, grabbing the radio to broadcast a final message. "Black Cat is hit. Continuing advance on foot." The 5 crewmen bailed out of the disabled tank into waist-deep snow and the chaos of battle. German machine gun fire raked the area, forcing them to take cover behind their burning vehicle. Jefferson assessed the situation quickly. His company was scattered, engaged in individual firefights throughout the forest. The infantry they were supporting had gone to ground, pinned down by German fire. Without working radios, his had been in the tank. He had no way to coordinate with other elements of the battalion. "We need to take out that anti-tank gun," he told his crew, shouting to be heard over the din of battle. "It's got the whole advance pinned down." Sergeant Thomas pointed to a slight rise to their left. "If we can get there, I think I can spot it. Probably got a clear field of fire from that position." Jefferson nodded. "Dixon, you're wounded. Stay here with the tank. The rest of us will try to flank the gun position." Despite protests from Dixon, who insisted he could still fight despite shrapnel wounds to his leg, Jefferson and the 3 others began making their way through the snow, using trees for cover as they moved laterally across the German line of fire. Progress was agonizingly slow. The deep snow made each step a struggle, and they had to freeze in place whenever German machine guns swept the area. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes, they reached the rise Thomas had indicated. Cautiously, Jefferson raised his head just enough to survey the area ahead. Through a gap in the trees, he could see the German position. Not 1 anti-tank gun, but 3, positioned to cover the most likely avenues of approach. Around the guns, perhaps 15 German soldiers manned machine gun nests and prepared ammunition. "Too many for a frontal assault," Jefferson whispered to his men. "We need to get word back to the battalion." Before they could formulate a plan, the distinctive sound of tank treads crunching through snow reached them. From their elevated position, they could see 3 more Shermans from their company advancing along a different route, unaware of the anti-tank guns lying in wait. "They'll be slaughtered," Sergeant Thomas said grimly. "Same as us." Jefferson made a split-second decision. "Williams, you were a quarterback in college, right? Think you can throw a grenade far enough to hit that ammunition pile by the center gun?" The Private First Class Marcus Williams, the loader, looked skeptical. "Maybe, Lieutenant, but that's at least 30 yards and in this cold." "If you can get close enough, the ammunition will do the rest," Jefferson said. "Thomas Johnson, you lay down covering fire when Williams throws. I'll try to get around to the right and create a diversion." Before his men could protest the dangerous plan, Jefferson was moving. crawling through the snow toward a position that would let him approach the German emplacement from an unexpected angle. The cold numbed his fingers as he clutched his M1 carbine, standard issue for tank crews when operating outside their vehicles. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the winter air. When he reached a position about 40 yards from the rightmost German gun, Jefferson took a deep breath and fired 3 shots into the air. As expected, the German gunners swiveled toward the sound, momentarily distracted from their vigilance over the main approach. In that crucial moment, William stood up from his position and hurled a grenade with all his strength toward the central gun position. His aim was true. The grenade landed directly beside a stack of 75mm shells awaiting use. The resulting explosion was far larger than a single grenade should have caused. The ammunition detonated in a chain reaction, destroying the center gun and killing or wounding most of its crew. The blast was so powerful it damaged the gun to the right as well, rendering it inoperable. The German soldiers, stunned by the unexpected attack from their flank, scrambled to reorient their defenses. In the confusion, the approaching American tanks spotted the German position and opened fire, their 75mm guns and 50 caliber machine guns sweeping the area. Jefferson and his crew seized the opportunity to advance on the remaining operational anti-tank gun. In a brief but intense firefight, they killed or captured the surviving German gunners and secured the position. By mid-morning, the 761st had broken through the initial German defensive line and established the beginnings of a corridor toward Bastogne. The cost had been high. 8 tanks destroyed and nearly 30 men killed or wounded, but they had accomplished their mission. As Jefferson, reunited with elements of his company, supervised the treatment and evacuation of wounded men, he was approached by a war correspondent who had been attached to the 26th Division. "Lieutenant," the reporter called, picking his way through the churned-up snow of the battlefield. "Lieutenant Jefferson?" Jefferson turned, surprised to see a civilian in the combat zone. "Yes?" "Bill Richardson, Stars and Stripes," the man introduced himself, extending a gloved hand. "I saw what happened this morning. Your actions broke the deadlock." Jefferson shook the offered hand briefly before turning back to his work. "Just doing our job. My men deserve the credit." "That's not how the infantry CO tells it," Richardson persisted. "He says you personally led the assault that took out those anti-tank guns after your own tank was knocked out." Jefferson sighed. "Look, Mr. Richardson, we've got wounded to evacuate and positions to secure. Whatever story you're looking for, I'm looking for the truth." Richardson interrupted. "A Negro tank officer leading one of the most successful actions in breaking the Bastogne siege. That's news, Lieutenant, whether you want it to be or not." Jefferson studied the reporter's face, looking for signs of mockery or condescension, but found none. "You actually want to write about this, about us?" "The 761st has been in combat for over 5 months," Richardson said. "That's longer than most tank battalions last. You've fought from Normandy to the Bulge, and from what I hear, you've done it while overcoming prejudice from your own side as well as enemy fire." "Yes, Lieutenant, I want to write about it." The resulting article, published in Stars and Stripes in January 1945, was one of the first major pieces of mainstream recognition for the contributions of black combat units in the European theater. Though sanitized according to the conventions of the time, with no mention of the discrimination faced by black troops from their fellow Americans, it nonetheless brought the achievements of the 761st to wider attention. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last major German offensive of the war. By January 1945, Allied forces had recovered the ground lost to the initial German advance and were once again pushing toward the German heartland. The 761st, having distinguished itself during the battle, remained attached to the 26th Division for the final drive into Germany. The fighting during these final months was some of the most difficult of the war. German resistance varied wildly. In some areas they encountered fanatical defense by SS units and Hitler Youth formations. In others, mass surrenders by Wehrmacht soldiers who had lost all faith in final victory. For Lieutenant Jefferson and the men of the 761st, the advance through Germany was a time of mixed emotions. Pride in their accomplishments and growing confidence in their abilities were tempered by exhaustion from months of continuous combat and grief for fallen comrades. The physical and psychological toll of prolonged combat was evident in all of them. Jefferson had lost 15 pounds from his already lean frame. A persistent cough, developed during the bitter cold of the Ardennes, refused to go away. More concerning were the nightmares that plagued him whenever he managed to snatch a few hours of sleep, vivid recreations of battles fought, men lost, and split-second decisions that meant life or death. In March 1945, during operations in the Rhineland, Jefferson's company was assigned to support an infantry assault on a heavily defended German town. The defenders included elements of an SS Panzer Grenadier Division, fighting with the fanaticism characteristic of such units. The attack began well, with Jefferson's tanks breaking through the outer defenses alongside infantry from the 104th Division. But as they entered the town itself, the column was ambushed by concealed anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust-equipped infantry. 3 Shermans were knocked out in the first minutes of the engagement, their crews either killed or forced to abandon their vehicles. Jefferson, commanding from the 4th tank in the column, found himself cut off when a building collapsed between his tank and the rest of the American forces, blocking the narrow street. "Driver, back up, find another route," he ordered, scanning the surrounding buildings for threats through his periscope. Before the tank could move, a Panzerfaust round struck its right side, penetrating the armor. Through some miracle, the shaped charge failed to ignite the ammunition or fuel, but the blast killed the driver and severely wounded the assistant driver. As smoke filled the tank, Jefferson made the call. "Everybody out, back to friendly lines." The 3 surviving crew members bailed out into the chaos of street fighting. The gunner, Sergeant Thomas, was hit by machine gun fire the moment he emerged from the turret, falling limply across the tank's hull. Jefferson and his loader, Private Williams, dragged Thomas into the shelter of a partially collapsed building, bullets striking all around them. A quick examination confirmed what Jefferson had feared. Thomas was dead, a burst of machine gun fire having torn through his chest. "What now, Lieutenant?" Williams asked, his young face streaked with soot and spattered with Thomas's blood. Jefferson checked his carbine, 6 rounds remaining, and the single grenade on his belt. Their situation was dire, cut off from friendly forces in the middle of an enemy-held town with minimal ammunition and a fanatical enemy searching for them. "We need to find our way back to our lines," Jefferson said, trying to orient himself in the unfamiliar town. "South, I think. Stay low. Move from building to building." For the next several hours, Jefferson and Williams engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with German patrols searching the town. They moved cautiously from one bombed-out building to another, freezing in place whenever German soldiers passed nearby. Their progress was hampered by having to avoid open areas and main streets where they would be easily spotted. By nightfall, they had covered less than half the distance back to American lines, and Williams had been wounded by shrapnel from a German grenade thrown into a building they had just vacated. "Leave me, sir," Williams urged, as Jefferson bandaged his leg, using strips torn from his own undershirt. "You can move faster alone." "That's not happening, Williams," Jefferson replied firmly. "We go out together or not at all." As darkness fell, they took shelter in the cellar of a ruined house on the edge of town. The sounds of battle had receded, suggesting the American forces had pulled back to regroup for another assault, likely the next day. In the cold darkness of the cellar, with Williams drifting in and out of consciousness from blood loss and shock, Jefferson faced the grim possibility that they might not survive until rescue came. If the Germans conducted a thorough search of the town during the night, their hiding place would almost certainly be discovered. Around midnight, Jefferson was startled by sounds from the street level of the ruined house, footsteps moving cautiously across debris-strewn floors. He raised his carbine, aiming at the cellar door, ready to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The door creaked open slowly, and a flashlight beam cut through the darkness. Jefferson's finger tightened on the trigger. "Hello? Anyone down there?" came a voice, speaking German-accented English. "American soldiers, perhaps?" Jefferson remained silent, his aim unwavering. "I am alone," the voice continued. "I lived in this house. I heard someone come in earlier. I want to help if you are Americans." Still, Jefferson did not respond. It could easily be a trap, a German soldier using English to lure them into revealing themselves. The flashlight beam swept the cellar, eventually finding Jefferson and Williams in the corner. The light immediately pointed away, as if not wanting to blind them. "Ah, there you are," the voice said. "One of you is wounded. Yes, I have some medical supplies. Not much, but better than nothing." A figure descended the cellar stairs slowly, hands clearly visible. In the dim light, Jefferson could make out an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, dressed in civilian clothes. "Why would you help us?" Jefferson asked. His carbine still trained on the man. "Because I hate what has become of my country," the old man replied simply. "Because my son was killed on the Russian front in a war that should never have been fought. Because I was a doctor before they took away my license for treating Jewish patients." He paused. "And because you are human beings who need help. Is that not reason enough?" Cautiously, Jefferson allowed the man to approach Williams and examine his wound. The German worked efficiently, cleaning the shrapnel cuts and applying proper bandages from a small medical kit he carried. "The wounds are not so bad," he reported, "but there is infection beginning. He needs antibiotics soon." "Our forces will attack again at dawn," Jefferson said. "If we can hold out until then." The old man shook his head. "The SS are conducting house-to-house searches. They will find you here before morning." He thought for a moment. "There is a better place, a root cellar behind my neighbor's house. It is well hidden, and the family fled weeks ago. I can show you." Jefferson hesitated, torn between the need to move to a safer location and the risk of trusting this stranger. "Why should I believe you?" The old man sighed deeply. "You have no reason to, I suppose, but consider this. If I wanted to betray you, I could simply have reported your presence when I first discovered you. The SS would give me extra rations for such information." His logic was sound. Jefferson nodded slowly. "All right, but understand, if this is a trap, you'll be the first to die." The German nodded solemnly. "That seems fair." With Williams supported between them, they made their way cautiously through the darkened town. Twice they had to hide as German patrols passed nearby, but eventually they reached the root cellar the old man had described. It was indeed well concealed, accessible through a trap door hidden beneath a garden shed. "This should be safe," the German said, as they made Williams as comfortable as possible on a pile of old sacking. "The American artillery will begin again soon, I think. When your forces enter the town, you can rejoin them." As the old man turned to leave, Jefferson called after him, "Why are you really helping us? The truth." The German paused. "I told you the truth already, but perhaps not all of it." He turned back, studying Jefferson's face in the dim light filtering through cracks in the shed above. "I fought in the First War, you know, against Americans as it happens. After it was over, I visited your country, New York, Chicago, Washington. I saw black Americans there, not many, but some." He paused. "The things our leaders say about your people, and about Jews and Slavs, and so many others. I know they are lies. I have seen too much of the world to believe such nonsense." After the German left, Jefferson settled in to wait, checking his watch periodically by the glow of its radium dial. Williams slipped into uneasy sleep, his breathing shallow but regular. True to the old man's prediction, American artillery began pounding the town shortly before dawn. The barrage lasted nearly an hour, the concussions making dust and debris rain down even in their underground shelter. When the artillery stopped, Jefferson could hear the sounds of combat drawing nearer, the crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the distinctive sound of Sherman tanks advancing. He considered trying to reach American lines immediately, but decided it was safer to wait until friendly forces were closer. That decision likely saved their lives. In the final hours of German control, SS troops conducted a last sweep of the area, executing civilians suspected of sympathizing with the Americans. The old doctor who had helped them was among those killed, shot in his home alongside 3 other residents who had allegedly harbored anti-German sentiments. By mid-morning, the sounds of combat had ceased, replaced by the rumble of vehicles and English-speaking voices. Cautiously, Jefferson lifted the trapdoor and emerged to find American infantry securing the area. "Hold it right there," called a young lieutenant, raising his rifle. "Easy." "Lieutenant," Jefferson replied, keeping his hands visible. "First Lieutenant Wilson Jefferson, 761st Tank Battalion. I've got a wounded man down here." The infantry officer lowered his weapon, looking surprised. "Jefferson, They said you were KIA yesterday when your tank got hit. Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated, Jefferson replied with a tired smile. Now, how about some help with my loader? He's taken some shrapnel and needs medical attention. As medics evacuated Williams to a field hospital, Jefferson reported to the battalion headquarters, established in a partially damaged school building on the town's edge. His appearance there caused a minor sensation. He had indeed been listed as killed in action after witnesses saw his tank hit and subsequently reported no survivors. Captain Porter, who had been preparing letters of condolence to Jefferson's family, embraced him with uncharacteristic emotion. "Thought we'd lost you, Wilson." "Can't get rid of me that easily, James," Jefferson replied, the use of Porter's first name, a measure of how their relationship had evolved over months of shared combat. The campaign continued as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. The 761st, like all American units that had been in continuous combat since the previous summer, was operating well below full strength. Replacements arrived regularly, but never in sufficient numbers to fully compensate for losses. By April 1945, it was clear that Germany's defeat was imminent. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly eastward, while Soviet forces pushed westward from the other direction. The once mighty Wehrmacht was disintegrating, with large units surrendering en masse. For the 761st, now attached to the 71st Infantry Division, the final weeks of the European War involved a series of rapid advances against sporadic resistance, liberating towns and villages, occasionally engaging die-hard Nazi units still fighting for a cause that was clearly lost. It was during one such operation that Jefferson's company encountered Kaufering 4, a sub-camp of the larger Dachau concentration camp complex. Though not an extermination camp like those found further east, Kaufering was a place of horrific suffering where prisoners, primarily Hungarian Jews, were worked to death in the construction of underground aircraft factories. The scene that greeted the American liberators defied description. Hundreds of emaciated prisoners, many too weak to stand, wearing striped uniforms that hung from skeletal frames, bodies stacked like cordwood outside crude barracks, victims of starvation, disease, and wanton cruelty. The stench of death, disease, and human waste so powerful that hardened combat veterans gagged upon encountering it. For the black American soldiers, who had endured discrimination and segregation all their lives, the camp presented a sobering perspective on human capacity for evil. The racism they had experienced in America, real and damaging as it was, paled in comparison to the industrialized genocide they now witnessed. "I can't," Sergeant Evans began, then stopped, overcome by what he was seeing. "I can't understand how people can do this to other people." Jefferson, moving among the survivors and directing medical aid, could only shake his head. This is what happens when you convince yourself that some humans aren't really human, when you decide that certain lives don't matter. In the days that followed, the men of the 761st worked alongside other American units to provide emergency medical care, food and water to the survivors. Many of the tankers gave their own rations to the starving prisoners, ignoring regulations in the face of such desperate human need. For some of the Jewish survivors, the sight of their black liberators added another layer of surreality to an already overwhelming experience. "We heard the Americans were coming," one survivor told Jefferson through a translator, "but we never imagined. In Europe, we had rarely seen black people, and now to be saved by you." He grasped Jefferson's hand with surprising strength. "It is a double liberation. From the Nazis, yes, but also from our own limited understanding of the world." The liberation of Kaufering 4 was among the 761st's final combat operations. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally, bringing the European War to its official end. For the men of the Black Panthers, who had fought across France, Belgium, and Germany for over 9 months of continuous combat, the news brought a complex mixture of emotions: relief, pride, exhaustion, and uncertainty about what would come next. The 761st remained in Germany as part of the occupation forces throughout the summer of 1945. As the most experienced soldiers were rotated home, based on a point system that accounted for time in service and combat, The battalion gradually lost many of its original members. For Lieutenant Jefferson, now promoted to captain following his actions during the final German offensive, the decision of whether to remain in the military after the war presented a difficult choice. The army was slowly beginning to integrate, though full desegregation would not come until President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948. The combat record of units like the 761st had made it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction that black soldiers were unsuited for frontline duty. They're talking about keeping some Negro officers on permanent staff. Porter, now a major, told Jefferson as they supervised the battalion's transition to peacetime duties. "You should consider it, Wilson. You've got a future in the military if you want it." Jefferson was thoughtful. "A few years ago, I'd have jumped at the chance. But now—" He gestured toward a newspaper on Porter's desk, which carried stories about race riots in several American cities. "I'm not sure a uniform will change things back home. Maybe it's time to fight a different kind of battle." In August 1945, following the Japanese surrender that ended World War II entirely, Jefferson received orders to return to the United States. As he prepared to leave the men he had led through some of history's most devastating battles, he reflected on how far they had come, not just geographically but as soldiers and as men. His final address to his company was brief, devoid of grand pronouncements about racial progress or the significance of their achievements. Instead, he focused on what they had accomplished together. "Gentlemen," he began, looking out at the faces that had become as familiar to him as his own family, "we came to this continent as something of an experiment, the first Negro tank battalion in American history. Some doubted we could fight. Others were certain we would fail." He paused, memories of fallen comrades briefly overwhelming him. "We proved them wrong, not with words or arguments, but with actions. We fought alongside the best the army had to offer, against the best the enemy could field, and we prevailed. Remember that, whatever comes next, remember what you accomplished here." As the men applauded, many with tears streaming unashamedly down their faces, Jefferson felt a complex surge of emotions, pride in what they had achieved, sorrow for those who hadn't lived to see this moment, and apprehension about the world to which they were returning. The America that awaited the returning black veterans was a nation in transition. The war had accelerated social and economic changes already underway, creating new opportunities, but also new tensions. Black Americans who had served their country in uniform or worked in defense industries had experienced a degree of equality and respect often absent in civilian life. Many were unwilling to return to the status quo of pre-war segregation. Captain Wilson Jefferson returned to Chicago in September 1945. The hero's welcome he might have expected was muted. Newspapers that extensively covered the homecoming of white units gave little attention to black veterans. His combat decorations, impressive as they were, did little to help him find suitable employment or housing in a city still rigidly segregated by both law and custom. Yet Jefferson, like many of his fellow veterans from the 761st, brought back from Europe more than medals and memories. He carried a newfound confidence in his abilities, a deeper understanding of both humanity's capacity for evil and its potential for good, and a determination to continue the fight for equality on American soil. In the years that followed, Jefferson used the GI Bill to complete a degree in mechanical engineering, becoming one of the first black engineers hired by a major manufacturing company in the Midwest. He remained in contact with many of his comrades from the 761st, their shared experiences creating bonds that transcended the barriers of distance and time. The full recognition of the 761st's achievements would be slow in coming. It wasn't until decades after the war that the unit received the Presidential Unit Citation it had earned. Many individual acts of heroism performed by its members went unrecognized or were acknowledged only with lesser decorations than they deserved. Yet the impact of what they had accomplished could not be erased or diminished. They had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that black soldiers could fight with skill and courage equal to any troops in the American military. Their example helped pave the way for the integration of the armed forces and contributed to the broader civil rights movements that would transform American society in the decades following the war. In a speech at a reunion of the 761st in 1970, Jefferson, by then a successful businessman and community leader, reflected on the meaning of their service. "We weren't just fighting for America as it was," he told his aging comrades. "We were fighting for America as it could be, as it should be. A nation that truly lives up to its founding promise of equality and justice for all." That fight didn't end in 1945. In many ways, it was just beginning. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion had gone to war carrying the dual burdens of American racism and the need to prove themselves in combat. They returned having demonstrated not just their worth as soldiers, but the fundamental bankruptcy of the racial theories that had marginalized them. In destroying German forces on the battlefield, they had also begun to destroy the myths of racial inferiority that had for too long limited the opportunities of Black Americans. Their service represented not just a military victory, but a crucial step forward in America's long, unfinished journey toward fulfilling its founding ideals. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.